In the name of God,
Ladies and gentlemen,
the most compassionate, the most merciful, أيها السيدات
السلام
والسادة.
عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful.
السادة والسيدات الكرام.
Ladies and gentlemen,
يسعدني أن
I
أرحب
have
بكم
the pleasure to welcome you through the presentation of this very important event that is being convened by Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights under the title of the Challenges of Media Freedom Facing Impunity, Law Enforcement and Human Rights.
محدثكم سامي زيدان.
So my name is Sami Zaidan. I am a presenter and news anchor at Al Jazeera English channel.
تأتي الندوة في
So
هذا
this
التوقيت
seminar is being convened at this particular time in celebration of the International Day of Human Rights for Human Rights, which is an international occasion that is very important indeed when we remind countries and organizations about the priority of the respect of the most important and basic criteria when it comes to the rights of persons, when it comes to the preservation of their dignity and well-being. And since freedom of opinion and expression are the cornerstone when it comes to other rights and liberties, so the responsibilities and duties are shouldered by media persons through oversight and also the enabling of the public for them to know the truth and also to choose the positions that are in keeping with public interest, in keeping to be reassured that the decision makers are going to respect law enforcement and when they carry out their duty when it comes to their work. I would like to remind you that it is very important to activate the different international efforts that are being exerted in order to protect journalists who are witnesses of truth, particularly when they stand in the front line and when there is nobody to oversee what they're doing. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Al Jazeera Network shoulders and believes also the responsibilities that should be undertaken when it comes to the protection of certain journalists wherever they are. And Al Jazeera has paid a very dear price when it comes to the reinforcement of human rights and public liberties. We would like to remember in this very moment 11 of our colleagues have lost their lives when they were doing their job in Libya, Syria, Iraq and Yemen. And scores of my colleagues, male and female, have been subjected to arbitrary detention, and Mahmoud Hussein is still detained, and he has been detained since 2016, although his case had been described as arbitrary detention as it was described by the UN team. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we in Al Jazeera Media Network, we are very happy to have you amongst us here in this seminar that tries to reinforce dialogue in order for us to be able to reach common objectives, and we're going to have the opportunity to have discussions that are going to be carried out by many experts and leaders of so many institutions that work on the protection of journalists and also representatives of the diplomatic corps, particularly friendly countries that work for the protection and safety of journalists. And this is going to take place starting from tomorrow through 4 sessions that are going to start 9 a.m. tomorrow and end at 4 p.m. And now we would like to listen to 4 opening speeches before we start with the dinner. I would like to welcome the first speaker, Dr. Mustafa Suwag, the Director General of Al Jazeera Media Network. The floor is yours, sir. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. طاب مساؤكم. إذا قبل أن أبدأ
a brief talk, I would like to make sure that there is a translation because I would like to use Arabic, but I also would like the people here to understand what I'm saying. So, is the translation working? Working well? Okay, good. Alhamdulillah. In this case, أريد أن أتحدث فقط عن بعض النقاط التي تتعلق
of points
بعمل الجزيرة
that are relevant to the work of Al Jazeera Network and its contribution when it comes to freedom of press and the protection of journalists and the security and safety of journalists. And I do not want to talk about other matters that are
لأن ذلك سيكون الجزء الأساسي في حديثنا غدا. أولاً أود أن أشير إلى أن شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية تؤمن بقوة.
Al Jazeera believes very strongly about the importance of partnership. We do apologize, the line was cut for some seconds. And solidarity between the different media institutions and the different relevant organizations that work on human rights and also having access to information, also freedom of press and the ability for journalists to be able to do their job properly, and also that believes in solidarity between journalists in general. So I have to refer to a fact that is very important indeed. We do lack to a large extent this very strong solidarity between the different institutions, media outlets, and also between media personnel on the other hand. So I think that so many of the challenges that we do face, particularly when it comes to repressive and authoritarian countries, goes back to the lack of this solidarity. Because this solidarity, when it happens, it is going to be definitely having an impact on the policies that are being used by those countries, and perhaps would lead to so many changes in the practices of those countries. And because we believe in Al Jazeera Network in such solidarity, we do aim always to establish strong partnerships with the different organizations, relevant organizations that work on media freedom, in addition to our communication with the different journalists who contribute to this matter and this field, and all the relevant entities that might be of help in this regard. In addition to that, when it comes to the importance of the safety and security of journalists, Al Jazeera Network carries out so many efforts in order to cater for the right training for all its journalists, particularly those who work in the different hotspots that work as correspondents, because training journalists about techniques and standards of safety and skills that they should know of for their own safety contributes to the safety of journalists, and this is something that should be used as a system in all institutions. And within this framework, we try to give each and every journalist in Al Jazeera all what they need when it comes to their knowledge about international humanitarian law, because their knowledge about IHL would enable them to overcome difficulties, because so many of the problems that happen are the result of being unaware about the laws, the regulations from the part of journalists, and also the repressive entities such as security agents and policemen. So many of them do not know these rules because their countries do not make them know. such matters. The second point that I would like to talk about, Al Jazeera Network believes that we have to think about journalists as individuals
أفراد لهم خصوصيات
that have
خصوصياتهم
a particular kind of job, that have their own
ولديهم أطفال
particularities. They have families, they have children, they have their own issues and problems. They are not just numbers.
عندما نتحدث
That is why
عن أن
when we talk about
السنوات الأخيرة
the last 10 years,
أكثر من
we do see that there were in excess of 1,000 journalists that have died. So we know them only as a number, but we have to know them as individuals, as persons with their own particularities. Their families are still suffering. They are still suffering even after the death of their relatives, death that has taken place 10 years ago. So we have to shine light on the stories of those persons, because we would like all people worldwide to know about their stories, because this is going to be having an impact on our work.
عند الحديث
So when we talk about
لا أقول ضحايا الصحافة هم ضعاف
victims of journalism, and I do not call them victims of journalism, but of repressing agents, agents that repress journalists, and also the absence of justice when it comes to dealing with those persons, because we know from statistics that we do receive from the different institutions that are interested in such matters. The statistics show that 1 out of 10 of perpetrators, killers of journalists, only 1 out of 10 are being held accountable. And such accountability is sometimes either partial or only very limited.
الذين يقومون
So that is why
باغتيال الصحفيين
those who assassinate journalists
يقومون باغتيال الحقيقة
are those who
أن يحاسبوا
kill the truth, assassinate the truth. They should be held accountable, and they should be held accountable locally and internationally. The third point that I would like to talk about,
يجب أن نعمل
we have to
جاهدين على عدم
work
إفلات هؤلاء
very hard for those perpetrators
من الحالات
not
تبدو مستحيلة
to
ولكنها ليست كذلك
stay at large and not to be held accountable for what they are doing.
نجد الآليات
So we have to find the right mechanisms that would enable us to do so. We have to have the tools that will enable us to do so, the laws that we can lean on when we want to formulate the mechanisms whereby we can hold them accountable. And within this framework,
جزيرة مع شركاء
Al Jazeera Media Network, with its partners,
دولي بالصحافة IPI
in cooperation with the IPI and partnership with the IPI and other organizations, there are in excess of 70 organizations, all of them have worked together in order to prepare
النظام الخاص بحماية الصحفيين
a kind of an international declaration for the protection of journalists. And I do think you have a copy of that declaration on your tables. So this is not going to be the work of Al Jazeera on its own. This is going to be, or this was, the work that was carried out by so many organizations, so many institutions, so many legal persons, and so on and so forth.
وصل إلى ما ترونه الآن
And this is the outcome of the effort that was exerted. And we hope,
جمعية العامة للأمم
in cooperation with all our partners, to be able to make this paper reach the General Assembly, for it to become a charter or a law that people can lean on when it comes to dealing with such matter, which is the protection of journalists. Of course, there are so many tools and methodologies that can be followed and that we're going to discuss during the sessions that are going to take place. I hope that the forum is going to be fruitful, useful for journalism and journalists
البشرية
and all humanity that relies on our journalists, the messengers of truth. So these are the messengers that should be taken care of, and we should have the right environment in which they can work, because at the end of the day, we're talking about freedom of the press or freedom of media, and journalists cannot feel free in their work unless they will work in a safe and secure environment. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa Suwag. And now we would like to welcome to the floor Dr. Agnes Kalamar, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions.
I think people in Qatar are much taller than me. Anyway, you can see me, right? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you. Thank you to the Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberty and Human Rights. Distinguished participant and representative, in 2 days we're going to celebrate the International Human Rights Day, December 10. It will be December 10, 2019, and that will be the last of the decade. The decade of 2010-2019, for me, is almost a lost decade for human rights. And on too many aspects, it has been the decade of impunity. In fact, someone has recently talked about the age of impunity. Too many people who kill or order the killing of a journalist get away with it. They kill in the belief that no one will go after them, or that the response will be ineffective and will not lead to justice. Impunity is eating away at the rule of law, at democracy, and at freedom. Killing is the ultimate act of censorship, but impunity transforms the act of killing into a system. Impunity is not a single act. Impunity means collusion. Collusion of institutions, collusion of people, collusion of countries to hide the truth, to protect the perpetrators, to silence the uncomfortable reporting that journalists were unveiling. Behind impunity, there is a web of corruption, of threats, of fear, of cowardice, of incompetence. And behind impunity, there are institutions that fail to do what they are supposed to do. And this is why impunity must be combated relentlessly. Because if we let it happen, we are destroying our societies and our system of governance. Because impunity's darkness must not win. Because turning our back on what is intolerable is not an option. Because no one should get away with murder, no matter who they are or how high their station in life, no matter whether they raised the deadly fist or ordered the deadly blow. Because no country or authority should ever be able to buy their way out of accountability, no matter what their influence or strategic relevance, no matter who their friends are or the depth of their alliance. This is why I have committed to undertake an investigation into the killing of one particular journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. This is why I have committed to continue fighting for justice for Jamal, because justice for Jamal also means justice for Ahmed, Eduardo, Jorge, Lyra, Norma, Precious, Vadim, Daphne, or Anna. And it is for Jamal, and it is for all of them, and for many of them, that we demand, and I demand, justice. By insisting that no one, not even a power as influential a state as Saudi Arabia, should ever get away with murder, we are also standing up against any and all authorities that would seek to do the same, to kill with impunity journalists, human rights defenders and dissidents, and then audaciously, but comfortably, rely upon the indifference of the world to provide them crude cover. I am here tonight because I did have time in my schedule, and also because I wanted, and I see that gathering and Al Jazeera and the many people present here as essential in our fight against impunity and for justice. My personal journey over the last 10 months working on the investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi has shown to me that there are many people around the world that are prepared to stand up, and I think many of you here are prepared to do that, but there are also many others who are ready to move on, to turn the page, and to return to business as usual. That has been, unfortunately, what I have confronted for the last 3 to 4 months after releasing my report into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I have confronted the reluctance of many countries to do the right thing. There were some important statements made immediately after the killing and after the release of my report, but there has been limited action, limited committed actions to ensure that those words were not just empty statements. So I am here tonight to call on you to ensure and demand that the countries and the government, the United Nations, does not allow any country to get away with murder and with murdering a journalist, and that there are sanctions and punishment imposed on what was, in my case, at least in my investigation, a state-sponsored killing. This was not a rogue operation as Saudi Arabia continued to want to pretend. This was a state-sponsored killing under international law, backed up by the evidence that I have collected, backed up as well by Saudi Arabia's own public statement. So for a state-sponsored killing, which also included a violation of the Convention Against Disappearance, violations of the Convention Against Torture, a violation of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, a violation of the UN Charter prohibiting the use of force in times of peace. For all those violations, it is impossible for me to accept that we should move on, because this is sending such a wrong signal to the rest of the world. It is sending the absolute signal to many rulers around the world that they could kill with immunity and with impunity. So what does the fight now demand? I'm not convinced that immediately governments are going to be at the forefront of fighting that fight. I am convinced that civil society, international, national, the media, journalists, and the families of the journalists will be the one allowing for that fight to work, to lead to justice, as we are right now seeing in Malta, where over the last few weeks, thanks to the persistence of the family, the lies of the last 2 years have been uncovered. The cover-up has been unveiled, leading to the resignation of the Prime Minister. So what does it show to us? It shows that to demand justice for killing of journalists, we need determination and we need persistence and we need patience. It is not going to happen overnight. It may take months, it may take years, and our persistence and our determination not to forget is what is going to make a big, big difference. Second, the fight against impunity demands that we continue unsilencing, that we continue to unveil and to speak up. I've been extremely impressed by the work of the media, including Al Jazeera, for the last 10 months in terms of their investigative reporting into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. It has been absolutely essential to keep uncovering issues and acts and collusion. And that's what the fight for justice demands. What it also demands is that we put a lot of emphasis on investigation. We are talking about impunity, and we often think of what happened in a court of law. And what my work, not just over the last 10 months, but before that, has shown me is that actually impunity begins an hour after the killing. Impunity begins at the moment when the police begins its investigation and fail to do so. Impunity is unleashed when the police is unwilling or unable to collect the physical evidence, when the police is unable or unwilling to interview the witnesses. I was in Mexico a few years back, and I met with the police there. I was investigating another killing of a journalist, which had opened almost 6 years before my visit. And they showed me the file that they had for that particular journalist. It was 2-page long. 2-page long. They had not even interviewed the eyewitness to the killings. So impunity begins with an improper investigation. This is why the effort that we put into uncovering what happened, into speaking with the witnesses, into and to finding the physical evidence is so important for the fight against impunity. My own investigation into Jamal Khashoggi was a one-off in the history of the United Nations. I think what it showed is that there are potential there and that the UN can do more in terms of actual investigation of one single crime. The UN in the past has investigated war crimes or massive violations. They had never investigated one single crime, and certainly not a single crime of a journalist. And I think that's what we need to ask the UN to do more of, to investigate an emblematic killing of a journalist or of a human rights defender or of a dissident, because by so doing we can learn, we can unveil, and we can move forward in the search for justice. This is why in my recommendations I have asked for the United Nations to equip itself with a standing instrument for the investigation of targeted killings. At the moment, the UN has the human rights body, the OHCHR, but the OHCHR does not have the mandate to conduct criminal investigation. And there are no bodies within the United Nations system that can conduct international human rights criminal investigation. We have an international criminal court that deals with massive violations, but we have nothing to deal with a single killing, even if that single killing is revealing of a massive problem. This is why I have asked for the UN to equip itself with that standing instrument, and I'm calling on you to use all your channels and influence and power to advocate and to lobby for the creation of such an instrument. And in conclusion, I want to pay respect to the journalists and to Al Jazeera in particular, because of your relentless investigation and public reporting on the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but also on other killings of journalists and on the arbitrary detention of your colleagues and of other journalists. The work that you are doing, the public reporting on Al Jazeera and the public reporting by other journalists, to me is also a form of justice. If we cannot get justice in a court of law for the moment, let's get justice in the court of public opinion. Let's get justice on our TV screen or on our computer. And my call to you is to persist, to insist, and to expose. This is how we will amplify our demand for justice for all journalists slain. It will amplify our demand for justice for the many that are executed for their independence of mind, for their courageous coverage, and for their brave reporting. We need more independent journalism, particularly in the Middle East. I do hope that Al Jazeera will keep on forcing and pushing for its own independence and its own capacity and ability to report on all the hotspots of the regions without discrimination and in complete impartiality. That too is part of justice for Jamal and justice for all the other journalists that are being killed. It's ensuring that journalism remain independent and strong of any kind of pressure. And with you, I hope that the new decade that we will be beginning in a month's time will be the new decade of accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agnes Kalamar. And now we would like to give the floor to the third speaker, Mr. Guy Berger, Director of Division of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at the UNESCO. The floor is yours, sir.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening. In 2013, the United Nations General Assembly declared an International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. It's not often that the UN declares a special day, but they did it for good reasons and for reasons that continue. In this talk, I'm going to reinforce this because we have to feel more angry about these attacks and the impunity, and we have to move to awareness, and we have to augment and add to our actions. So we know that impunity describes the general situation for people who commit crimes against journalists. They are not punished. But it's quite a bland term, impunity. It describes an overarching commonality to all these attacks. Thousands of individual cases. 11 journalists killed who work for Al Jazeera, the portraits are outside. Each is an individual, unique journalist who experienced attacks on themselves, sometimes on their families, on their bodies, on their minds, on their technology, and even on their soul for doing their job. When we take all these attacks together and all the impunity, the killing attacks and other attacks, it reveals that we face a system-level, industrial scale of open license for attacks on journalism. Who is this a problem for? For whom is impunity a problem? Obviously, it's a problem for every journalist. But it's also, of course, a problem for society, because truth is at stake. And this at a time today when disinformation is not waiting at the door. It's rushing into our information system, clouding out science, trying to distract and destroy awareness of human rights. So impunity is a problem for journalists and for society. On the other hand, attacks with impunity seem like a solution for those who perpetrate these attacks. Or is it? Is it a solution for them? Last year, 2018, UNESCO ran a campaign which is called Truth Never Dies. So let me see if I can get my device to work here. Here we go. Truth Never Dies. This campaign was about being angry about the killings of journalists. It was about defying the killings and sending a message to the attackers that they would not silence the truth. It was about making a noise and about refusing to let the killing of a journalist become the killing of a story. When a journalist is murdered, we can have a moment of silence or we can make a lot of noise. That was a message to the attackers. That's a message of anger, it's a message of defiance, which are much needed responses. However, we also need to move to awareness, from anger to awareness. In 2019, this year, and before I come to that, let me just mention how Al Jazeera amplified this campaign last year, The Truth Never Dies, had a whole big focus on it. Thank you, Al Jazeera. For those of you who can see the screens, you will see a picture there. In 2019, we decided to move to greater public awareness, from anger to awareness. This was a message to the public. The message is the following: we will actively keep truth alive. Keep truth alive. One way to do this is to bring home to the public that attacks on journalists are not only in war zones, but in everyday situations. Here I would like to present to Dr. Swag some posters from this campaign, which I invite him to consider putting in your newsroom, putting in your public foyer when your journalists invite guests. These are posters. This poster says, "Every day, thousands of journalists risk their lives simply by leaving their home." This poster is of a car parked outside an apartment building. It says, "For a journalist, going out for lunch can mean never coming back." And this poster says, "Sometimes the most dangerous conflict zone for a journalist is home." This is a campaign, Keep Truth Alive, which is about raising awareness. It's about showing that journalists are at risk more and more today, wherever they are. It may be in a European country, it may be in an African country, it may be in an Asian country, and it may be in a Latin American country. This is what we face. Again, I thank Al Jazeera and other media for joining in this campaign, for helping to show the public that we all have a stake in keeping truth alive. Part of keeping truth alive was to produce this map, a map that people can click on, and we publicize this map, and Al Jazeera helped us to publicize this map. You can click on and see who was killed. You can see one of the 11 journalists who work for Al Jazeera who has been killed in this. you can learn a little bit about their stories. So, moving on a little bit from our two slogans. The two slogans, truth never dies and keep truth alive. Those are two slogans, one aimed at the perpetrators, truth never dies, one aimed at the public, keep truth alive, two sides of one coin. Now, to go forward to action, we have to have analysis. I also am happy to present to Dr. Swag a report. This report that UNESCO released very recently called Intensified Attacks, New Defenses, because we have to analyze what's going on if we want to move forward. This report unveils new facts that we all need to be aware of, and it shows us even more reasons why we should be angry. It shows there are nearly 500 killings in the past 5 years. It shows more killings today are taking place in non-conflict countries than in conflict countries. It also shows how states respond to UNESCO. The states have given UNESCO Secretariat a mandate to follow up what is the situation with impunity. You can see a list in this report of which states have responded for killings of journalists and which states have not responded, which states have responded but don't want to make their response public. This is an important set of information. This is the UN's official information on impunity collected by from the states themselves. You can see in the same report that actually over the past 5 years, there has been a rise in the number of states sending responses, and after that, a decline. What does that tell us about this situation? Looking ahead, we may also see further declines in responses by states to the UNESCO requests for information on judicial follow-up, and that depends on the visibility of the normative climate about safety of journalists. It depends on the state's interest in being responsive to this. When a state does not respond to the request about judicial process for killing of journalists, it's possibly a sign that nothing is happening. Because if there was something happening, the state might be more inclined to respond. In terms of trends, it's likely that we will see high levels of impunity continuing. We will also see impunity probably not just for the fatal attacks, but for the non-fatal attacks. In this report, you can see a whole range of attacks that violates rights, not the right to life, but other rights, and that are very effective in trying to silence journalists. These are attacks that bury the emerging truths collected by journalists under piles of fear, as well as then disinformation. But the report also shows, this report shows some cause for optimism. It shows that there are aggregated actions that are coming together. We see much greater strength and coordination within different constituencies, within the media, within the NGOs, within the academia, within member states who have these groups of friends at the UN, main UN organizations. Legal actors like judges are taking a stronger interest in this area, and within the UN family itself. So this report gives us some cause for hope because it shows that as much as we see intensified attacks, we're also seeing stronger responses. For next year, we as UNESCO invite you to join this trend of stronger responses. We invite you to come together to ally and augment our actions. In particular, is there anything you can do now, between now and April the 22nd, which is when UNESCO will hold its International Global Conference on World Press Freedom Day, with which Al Jazeera has been a real stalwart in partnering. This conference will be held in The Hague, the city of justice, next year, as I said, on the 22nd of April. It's important there that we can raise this issue of impunity. It's the next opportunity after impunity, after Human Rights Day, on the international calendar to make a noise and to show that we can continue to go forward. The theme for the World Press Freedom Day conference next year is journalism without fear or favor. This is a bold statement. It's to stand up against media capture on the one hand and attacks on the media on the other. Attacks and capture which seek to carve up and basically destroy editorial integrity, journalism independence, the service of journalism to the public, and the credibility of journalism. So my question is, how can we best use World Press Freedom Day, that will be worldwide with a global conference in The Hague, for further advances next year? I invite you to help intensify this pushback. We urgently need to be creative with new ideas about campaign messages, about how we can do more reportage and better reportage in the media, follow up on stories about attacks and about impunity, how we can be more creative about partnerships, about finding platforms to hammer this issue, to repeat and repeat and repeat. We also need more actions that we need to do differently. We need to work much more together in alliances that transcend differences. For example, alliances between the media houses and the journalism unions, of which there's too much of a divide at the moment on this important issue. If we can do all this, we can progress inch by inch until we have no longer a reason to feel angry. Because if we can establish in the public and in the political mind that journalism is not a crime, and that journalists are not the criminals, but the real criminals are those who attack journalists and do so without the deterrent of serious punishment. If we can do that, we will no longer need to feel angry. But for now, we will keep our anger, we will keep raising awareness, and we will keep on augmenting our actions, because the alternative is to accept attacks on journalists as if this was natural, and that none of us can ever do. So, anger to awareness, to analysis, to augmented action, all aimed at a world where Impunity Day is a time not to protest the situation in the present, but to remember a past that has become a painful memory, but which is absent from our future. We will keep truth alive. Shukran.
Thank you very much,
Shukran jazilan.
Sayyid Guy Berger.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guy Berger.
والآن
And now,
سيداتي سادتي
distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to welcome the fourth speaker, Ms. Barbara Triomfi, the Executive Director of the International Press Institute, the IPI.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the Al Jazeera Network, Dr. Mustafa Suag, the Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights, and IPI-owned board member Sami El-Haj, for inviting me to this important event today. It's a great honor to address you tonight on behalf of the International Press Institute and our global network of editors and journalists around the world. As speakers before me have already said, we are living in times of profound crisis, in times when we are observing at the same time a global crisis of the international and local mechanisms of protection of journalists, combined with a much discussed crisis of the business models that have supported independent journalism for many decades. We are living today in a world where, as Agnes Kalamar said, it is possible to brutally murder a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, in a foreign country, a journalist working for one of the best-known US media, and get away with complete impunity from it, in spite of very poor efforts by the perpetrators to hide the crime or those responsible for it. We're living in a world where countries like Egypt or Turkey can imprison tens of journalists, holding them in prison for months, even years, confronting them with greatly unfair judicial processes aimed at fulfilling political purposes rather than supporting the rule of law. And these too with complete impunity as the world looks away. We're living in a world where the two traditional defenders of human rights and media freedom, the US and the UK, have stopped fulfilling that role. And the vacuum they have left has not been filled by any other powerful actor, leaving space to undemocratic leaders who believe they can just disregard international human rights commitments. And we are living in a world where in a country like Pakistan, government ministers' criticism of a newspaper article leads to angry mobs taking to the streets in front of a newspaper's office and calling for the publisher and the editor, IPI board member and CPJ award winner Zafar Abbas, to be hanged because they're traitors. And indeed, they're some of the most brave editors and publishers the world has seen. Or in the Philippines, the editor of one of the few government-critical news organizations in the country, Maria Ressa, is facing such intense judicial harassment that much of her time and resources are dedicated to defending herself from constant threats of going to prison and her news organization, Rappler, from being forcibly shut down. And across the world, so many courageous journalists and human rights defenders are targets of intense online campaigns of smear and hate against them that reach unprecedented and unimaginable levels of violence and go viral on social media. And we know online violence so easily can turn also into real-world violence. They're attacked because they're women or member of minorities or a combination of these. And they dare to challenge those in power by revealing their corruption, crimes, and the impunity they enjoy. Agnes Callamard, who has done an incredibly courageous work to counter the extrajudicial killing of journalists, had to feel this on her own scale, being a target of such a campaign. At the same time, we observe an unprecedented financial weakness in the news industry, with local news organizations practically disappearing and leaving news deserts behind, as advertisers prefer the micro-targeting offered by social media platforms and search engines to traditional advertising. And readers prefer to get their information from their supposed circles of friends or trusted sources on Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp, failing to question who is truly behind some of the information and opinion they absorb. In this unprecedented confusion generated by shifting boundaries between news, opinions, propaganda, and advertising, journalism is needed more than ever. And it represents the only force challenging the dissemination of disinformation that is creating the divisive societies needed for populists and undemocratic leaders to come to power. And journalism, strong, investigative, local-level journalism is needed as the only credible force to fight corruption, as it was mentioned before, to expose abuses of power, to make people aware of political leaders who are acting against the public interest, to ensure voters can be truly informed and don't allow populist propaganda to guide their preferences at the ballot box. But while we cannot afford to lose journalism, in countries where governments have been successful at silencing the largest part of their critics, and as the crisis has been continuing and becomes normalized, we risk losing the new generation of journalists as well. In Hungary, Egypt, the Philippines, Turkey, Poland, just to mention a few countries where independent journalism is not tolerated, young journalists have become so disenchanted with the conditions under which they are forced to operate and the lack of opportunities to learn the profession as they and we intended, that they see themselves forced to leave the country or change profession. So while robust journalism, independent journalism is needed today more than ever, we risk losing it not only at the hands of brutal dictators or of democratically elected undemocratic leaders, or at the hand of organized crime that has penetrated state institutions to the point that independent journalism remain the only true challenge to it, but also because we failed to raise the next generation of journalists, that we failed to offer them successful role models and make young journalists believe that journalism is still today the force of state and strong enough to hold the powerful accountable. While the situation is dire, the good news is there is still a lot of great journalism out there. From global news organizations like Al Jazeera that have brought a new type of journalism, a journalism that truly challenges those in power and holds them accountable, to countries where this wasn't practiced before, or to globally respected news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and many others that have succeeded in developing successful business models by offering to their audiences nothing more than quality, or to new online news outlets like The Wire in India, Premium Times in Nigeria, Rappler in the Philippines, Mediascope in Turkey, Madame Azar in Egypt, and many others that have been able to take advantage of online spaces to disseminate independent information in restricted environments and have become the new trusted sources for young audiences. There is still excellent journalism out there. And as was mentioned before, new alliances are being created among those who share the same values in journalism to support each other at the local and at the global level. The alliances that Dr. Mustafa was talking about before and that badly needed. They deserve our support. The times we are witnessing today are not easy ones, but they're not easy ones for journalism, and they're disruptive and dangerous, but I want to believe that we are witnessing a period of transition and that maybe we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, as the community of those who believe independent journalism needs to be part and parcel of the world they want to live in is growing stronger. To quote Philippines editor and IPI board member Maria Ressa, these times force us to define exactly who we are, what values we live by, and what lines we will not cross nor allow others to cross. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا لك سيدة باربرا تريومفي. والآن سيداتي سادة نشكر السادة المتحدثين على كلماتهم
for their interventions. I would like to thank you for attending this event, and now I would like to invite you to dinner. So we're going to serve you dinner now. Bon appétit. Thank you so much.